Okay, Ed, am I recording? All right, so now we're recording. So welcome to those of who are watching this on on the recording. What I'm going to do now that we finished talking about vaccines. That is unfortunately not going to go as a topic that's not going away and for our country, but at least we finished talking about vaccines. I'm going to go back to this book, Modern Responsa. And I'm going to go through chapter 8 in the book, which is called Relationships with the Other. Now, in her introduction, which we're going to take a look at, the share screen. Gee, it's been a while since I've done this. There it is, share screen. There you go. Share screen. There you go. Okay. No, that's not what I wanted. There it is. Okay. This is can everybody see that? That large
Yes.
and clear? Good. Okay. I'm going to we'll keep this up. Uh, Relationships with the other. Now, this chapter has a number of different issues. Oh, I didn't. Let me just tell you what some of the issues are that we're going to be looking at the next few weeks, and I'll tell you how my thinking has been going. One is the first we'll take a look at today is engaging in a public fast in sympathy with German Jews. While that is a very specific question, which occurred in the 1930s, it made me think about rabbis, public issues, and how rabbis respond to public issues, and especially in the United States, since we've recently had this question of rabbis or clergy endorsing people, and we had, of course, the election of the mayor in New York. So that made me think about those things. So we're going to take a look at that. We'll take a look at this question of why a rabbi in the 1930s chose not to ally himself with other rabbis and Jewish leaders who were proclaiming a public fast to protest the Nazi boycott of Jewish businesses. And then we'll take a look at that larger issue, pulpits, rabbis, and public issues. And we'll take a look very specifically. You may know that two prominent rabbis in Manhattan took opposite views about what they should do about before the election for the mayor. And we'll take a look at their sermons. So we see specifically what they said. And as a matter of fact, I'm very interested to hear the feedback from the class to a rabbi taking a position on a candidate. So we'll take a look at that. Then the rest of the chapter goes on to relationships between different Jewish groups on the burial of a person converted by liberal rabbis. Can you bury such a person in a Jewish cemetery? Transcendental meditation, um, yoga. Can you have a Jewish worship service with yoga? We have many synagogues have been doing that. The status of non-Jews in Jewish law and law today. And of course, that is a larger issue in the many synagogues, not only the status of non-Jews, how we think about the non-Jewish world, um, but also might even talk about a little bit about their status within synagogue life. As we know, with large numbers of intermarried Jews, this is still a current issue within the Reform and conservative movements. Not only what are their status within the synagogue itself, but what sorts of ways can we have a synagogue where the spouses of many of our members may be non-Jews? What can they do? Should they do? Should they not do? Those will be our issues. Okay, so that's chapter 8 in Rabbi Bar Mash's book. All right, so we're going to start with the relation. This is her introduction. Um, since antiquity, Jews have molded their identity through a combination of relationships within and outside the Jewish community. Okay, and we know in ancient times, ancient Israelites, they lived in two kingdoms, but there were a lot of non-Jews. By the way, the Bible talks about in the Chumash about destroying all the non-Jews, and we realize that, well, maybe the Bible talks about it, but clearly that did not happen because we know that later books of the Bible make it very clear that the Midianites are still around, and some of the others that there's talk of earlier in the books of the Bible about destroying. So those they were still around, and the prophets are particularly concerned about them. Um, the view that our religion is distinct from the religions practiced around them. How could they adopt, and what did they have to reject as they interacted with other peoples? All right. Jews participate more freely in open societies, have to navigate their relations with others in more complex ways. So we're going to start with the one with Rabbi Chaim Elazar Shapira, a Hasidic rabbi in Hungary, who refused to participate in a public fast with other Jews in solidarity with German Jews as the Nazi regime began to unleash atrocities upon them. Here was the question of a rabbi taking a stance on a public issue, and he was asked to join in with other rabbis who had decided to do so. Some did not, but why did he not? Okay. All right, then we'll go about this question about burials and cemeteries, which, by the way, is still a question. We might look at that in some detail. After all, what happens when you have an intermarried Jew and both he or she and their spouse want to be buried together in a Jewish cemetery? Can you do that? Can you not do that? A significant issue. Here's the question, though. Here's the question of a person who converted under Reform auspices. Okay, then we're going to talk about transcendental meditation, whether it's idolatry. What about yoga? Yoga is very popular, by the way, in Israel. I don't know if any of you have been to Israel, but you see lots of signs for yoga classes. There are even synagogues that have brought meditation into their services. And then the modern expression of Jewish hatred and how we feel about non-Jews. Well, I think we also need to talk about how synagogues and Jewish organizations, deal with these questions. Okay. Any comments, questions before we begin our new unit? Okay. And actually, we'll take a look at Rabbi Barmash herself has some questions about about what we're going to look at. These are her study questions for this chapter. And she asks, how does Rabbi Shapira's background affect his response? Morning, Fran. Good to see you.
Good morning. Good to see you, too.
Thank you. Good to be seen. And a question also is, how does Rabbi Shapira understand why is this? Again, this is early 1930s, 1933.
Yeah.
And which Jews does Rabbi Shapira oppose? And there's talk about, divisions. We've got some very serious divisions within the Jewish community nowadays, right? We often hear talks about how can we be unified? And what is his argument and his ruling? So we'll take a look at those questions as we take a look at his let's go back to his actual words. Okay. A prominent leader among the ultra-Orthodox rabbis of Hungary. Hungary was a very interesting country in Europe. It was comprised of many different types of Jews. Yes, there were Hasidim and ultra-Orthodox, but there were also in the large cities Jews who were very much part of the regular society. When we think about how well integrated, for example, some German Jews were in German society, so too in Hungary, in places like Budapest, they were very well modern and integrated into the society. Okay. He expressed harsh and his stark criticism of other Jewish leaders and organizations, including the Belzer Rebbe. So don't think that all the Hasidim agreed on everything. The modern example, of course, is Satmar and Lubavitch are very much different. And there hasn't been too much going on, but there have been instances of great tension between the two. Okay. Rabbi Shapiro's followers were awed when his curse of the Tsar during the high holidays in 1917 was followed by a coup and the execution. Imagine, excuse me, if your rabbi just before the Russian Revolution cursed the Tsar, right? And the Tsar fell, right? Similarly, his curse of the princes of the earth during the high holidays in 1918 was followed by the abdication of the Kaiser. Okay, so here you have a rabbi who cursed secular leaders who then fell. That his curse on the British Empire in 1919, well, that would have to wait about 30 years for the British Empire to fall. That didn't work so well, okay? Did not seem to affect his followers' steadfast loyalty to him. I mean, people can be more loyal to the leader whether or not what he or she says proves to be accurate. Okay, all right. Now, he followed the viewpoint opposing any and all innovations in Jewish life, education, culture, medicine, or technology. We see that in many circles in ultra-Orthodoxy today. He rejected the British government's 1917 Balfour Declaration, maintaining that only a miraculous redemption permit Jews to resettle the land of Israel. To this day, in the Satmar community, there is a very strong opposition to Zionism. Why? Because the redemption of the land of Israel is going to occur through God's will, not through draining the swamps and building the kibbutzim. And anybody who drains the swamps and builds the kibbutzim is acting contrary to God's will, which is that we should just wait for that redemption. He opposed the migration of European Jews to America, which is going to be a place where Jews would not be as religious. Some have argued, by the way, that the American Jewish community very strongly influenced by the fact that the people who immigrated were probably in general less traditional than those who did not, because of this fear. You go to America and you lose connection to Judaism. Warned that those who immigrated to the land of Israel, they would die a violent death. Okay. So now we have 1933, a Nazi boycott of Jewish businesses. Rabbi Shapiro was asked to sign a proclamation endorsing a public fast on an agreed upon day for all Jews worldwide in solidarity with German Jews. We know biblically and in the Talmud, when our community is faced with great serious problems, a common response would be to fast. And this was well known. And so there was a public call for all Jews all over the world to fast, 1933. Okay, that sound like a reasonable request? Terrible things are happening. We know terrible things were happening already to Jews in Germany in 1933. So here's the request. Let's have a public fast all over the world. Okay. Rabbi Shapiro strongly rebukes Jews for failing to comprehend that Nazi persecution is merely a part of the global calamities and upheavals that will usher in the Messianic age. Yeah, how do you react to that statement?
Not good.
Not good, right? Historical events are moved by God, and human agency is not to be applied, right? If we see terrible things happening, well, we know there will be vast upheavals, according to some of the biblical texts, that will occur before the Messianic age. So, therefore, that must be how you understand what's going on. He harshly criticizes Jewish leaders, including other Hasidic leaders, as accomplices of the demonic world. Now, here's a direct quote. You're requesting my consent to obtain a public fast on the account of the murders and oppression that have occurred to our fellow Jews in Germany due to our many sins. Now, you will find this argument to this day among certain very right-wing groups in the Jewish community. Why did the Holocaust happen? Because we were sinning, right? You can find, if you assume that everything that happens is an expression of the divine will, if Jews are punished, well, doesn't it say in the Bible that God will punish us if we sin? Therefore, that's how he sees it. Our fellow Jews' thoughts until now been confused. They have yet to see the truth, for I think that the war is just the period of tribulations preceding the coming of the Messiah, when Jews return to God by observing the commandments. Only then will we be redeemed through the coming of the righteous Messiah, made soon be at hand. In other words, human efforts, such as we'll see, he talks about Zionism, to bring about a safer situation for Jews, are useless. Not only are they useless, they're counterproductive because they are contrary to God's will, which is we just wait for the Messiah. However, the legions of the Sitra Achra is a Aramaic term, literally meaning the other side, but it's also used in the realm of evil in mystical texts, including hypocritical leaders among the many Hasidic rabbis have led all Israel astray. For their main action is just to pray for the welfare of the nations and other foolishness. They have turned things upside down, as in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, but in their case against the Torah. They flatter the non-Jews, give them large amounts of money. At the same time, I have cried aloud at the risk of my life from the day the war began until now. Every day is worse than the previous day. That their despicable peace will be worse for all Israel, especially from German Jews, than the war in every way. Now, this is 1933. Not clear what he's referring perhaps to World War I. Okay. Dismissing of the Jews with greater disdain, Rabbi Shapiro renounces any solidarity German Jews whose stores have been open on Shabbat and now are forced to close during the week. He urges them to repent, but he doubts they will. In other words, many German Jews, as I think we all know, very much involved in the culture of the modern world. They kept their stores open on Shabbat. Hey, where I grew up in New York, if you go back to the 1950s, at least in my neighborhood, there were several kosher delis, but they were open on Shabbat, right? That was a very common pattern in parts of New York, and a lot of store owners who were not Orthodox had to keep their stores open on Saturday just to make a living. Okay. I thought that when the Nazis imposed the boycott in Germany against Jewish businesses, this was definitively not a reason to authorize a fast. Why? Why should we not authorize a fast? Because the overwhelming majority of the Jews in Germany violate Shabbat publicly by keeping their stores open on Shabbat. They are now being paid back measure for measure through the closing of their stores for the rest of the week. So, according to him, Why are the Nazis having this boycott? What's the
Was
reason for that?
they were punishing them,
They're punishing the
right?
Jews. Why and why are the Jews being punished?
Because they kept the stores open.
On Shabbat, i.e., again, all historical actions are seen as the will of the divine. And if now Jews are being punished, it must be because they sinned. And what was their sin? They kept their stores open on Shabbat, and now the Germans are forcing them to close their stores and boycotting them throughout the rest of the week. If the German Jews do not repent for their sin of violating Shabbat, how can we reinforce their practice of profaning the Shabbat through authorizing a public fast? It is better to warn our fellow Jews from the beginning, or even though they have sinned, they will see and understand that it is the finger of God punishing them for violating the Sabbath, and they will return to God by closing their stores and ceasing from their work on Shabbat. He seems to believe that the oppression of the Nazis would end if the Jewish store owners would just close their stores on Shabbat. Then we will pray for them and authorize a public fast for their rescue and welfare together with all Israel. And I can't be with them. I can't agree with what they're proposing because they're sinners. Now, if they will stop their sinful ways, then we can talk about a fast. I cannot agree to sign my name to this proclamation. For who would agree to join this fast in this generation of apostasy? Will the Zionists, people he really doesn't like, the adherents of Mizrahi, again, more pro-Zionism, the members of Aguda Yisrael, different groups within the Jewish community, and the like return to God in Judaism. Now he's complaining about groups that are very traditional, pro-Orthodox group, pro-Zionist groups, even Orthodox Zionist groups he's complaining about. Okay. Then he's going to go even further by using some other Jewish sources. The Talmudic ruling that sinners must participate in a public fast, a ruling that may signify that the German Jews whom he criticizes for violating Shabbat are worthy of a public fast. But, there is a possibility, there are some people who are sinning. Maybe we can join in with them. And he points out that in the Talmud, it says, any fast that does not include the participation of the sinners of the Jewish people is not a fast. Now you're going to say to me, against what I've just said, that in the Talmud, there's evidence that you have to include everyone. And if there are sinners, you include them in the fast. And if you don't include the sinners, then it's not really a fast. Fast being something that's going to cause God to relieve the oppression. They learned that from the galbanum, a substance whose smell is foul, one of the ingredients of the incense in the temple. In order to make the incense in the temple, you had to, and the incense was this wonderful smelling material. You had to use something that had a terrible odor. So isn't that like putting the sinners together with other Jews and we can all fast? This means that the sinners may comprise only 1/10 of those who fast, understood by the Maharash Shar and Chidushei Agadot, who taught that the essential matter is that 10 righteous Jews participate in the fast, then they combine with the 11th part of the sinners, as in the addition of the galbanim to the incense. In other words, you can have, in a public fast, some sinners. It also appears that the Maharshar means sinners who have not separated from the way of life of their community. But our situation does not warrant a worldwide fast, for those wicked Jews in Germany are nearly as numerous as we are, and almost all of them separate themselves from the Orthodox community's way of life. Well, even if you argue from the Talmudic source that if 1/10 of the people aren't following the Orthodox life, well, we know in Germany it's more than 1/10. Since it's more than a tenth, this ruling doesn't apply. Since he deems the majority of German Jews to be sinners, he concludes, therefore, it is definitely not appropriate, in my humble opinion, to authorize a general worldwide public fast. May God have mercy on the remnant of his people with salvation and redemption. Don't do it. Don't take what is clearly a political action. And why can't we take this political action? Because there are too many sinners, and the sinners themselves have caused the oppression, and therefore it is not going to be effective. And I can't join with them on this. My group, my followers cannot join to make a united Jewish statement in this case. Okay. Comments, questions to this one?
How backward, how narrow-minded, how stupid.
Now, specifically, why is it stupid and why is it narrow-minded?
Well, he's taking his point of view, but he doesn't realize the greater Jewish world. He's thinking of himself and his group only, and not of all the Jews.
Okay. Yeah, he's thinking, right? In other words, he's causing divisions.
Right, and he's causing great divisions among the Jews. Of course, he doesn't know what's going to happen, but that's just such a narrow interpretation of the Torah and the Talmud also.
Okay, good. In other words, it's a question of when there is a danger, who do you join with, right?
Right.
Are the Jews who are, quote, outside the fold?
And he's missing the point in the Talmud from what you've been saying in all these years. There's a pro and a con for every issue. There's pros and cons, and he's not seeing both sides of the situation.
Well, he's coming from a theological position, right?
Right.
That sees all historical events as reflective of God's will. And he takes a very narrow theological position that if Jews are being oppressed, it's because they're sinning. That's what's happening. If they stop their sinning, then maybe we could join together with them, right? He says, if the Jews would close their stores on Shabbat, maybe we could work together with them.
Well, there's some Jewish groups that feel this way today about the whole Holocaust, that we all had to be punished.
Yes. Yes, this is a theological position which you do see in some very traditional circles. And again, all historical events are caused by God, and therefore Jews must have been sinning in order for the Holocaust to have happened. Of course, what is disturbing is that they can't even agree on what sin that was. Was the sin that they were Zionist? Was the sin that they were secular? You see that argument, and then there's some debate about exactly what that sin was, right?
I'm on the phone.
Charlie, did you have a comment?
No, I'm sorry. No,
It's a very
Okay. Well,
I'm
Tammy,
just listening.
okay,
No,
Tammy, and then Charlie. Okay.
it's a very parochial point of view that man has free will. When God created man, he infused him with God's abilities, but man has free will, and if you don't have free will, you might as well not live. You're just walking along and let God do everything to you. So it's a matter of whether you have free will or not. He's denying man's free will.
And at what point you take political action?
Right.
Charlie, were you going to say?
well, I mean, the thing with being a rabbi or being a leader, there's a time and place for things. I mean, sometimes it's just not the right time to get involved in an issue, or there's danger in getting involved. I mean, there's a lot of things you have to take into consideration other than right and wrong. I mean, as a leader, you have to be cautious in terms of what you do and how you do it.
Okay, but his view here is, I'm not going to take action, one, because this is God's will that's causing the oppression, and two, the people who are asking me to join with them are such sinners that they are people who are opposing God's will, and I can't possibly join with them, right?
It's also going up against the German government, you might say, at the time. Uh, Maybe that wasn't the time to protest, or maybe it was. You have to make these judgments.
We'll take a look at that in more detail. You're right. There's this question as to what is the appropriate time to take political action. That is a serious question, which we'll bring into this. But for his time, he had the specifics on a theological level not to take political action. And matter of fact, it would seem, based upon what he's saying here, it would be hard to imagine a situation where he would take political action.
Yeah, the fact that he could have just disagreed, but the fact that he went into such detail about why he disagreed, that he's condemning other Jews, it's terrible. As Charlie said, he could have said it's not the right time in history to open my mouth, but he opened it in such a negative way that it was more detrimental than positive. And all these blind followers follow him. Look how many horrible leaders we've had who follow crazy leaders. That guy down in the Caribbean, everybody drank the Kool-Aid, and other leaders around the world. Hitler.
Yeah. Any other comments on this? Although, well, we're not going to go into detail about Israel and Haredim there, but okay. So let's go to that issue, and I admit this is a bit of a stretch, but I have to say, when I read this teshuva in Rabbi Barmash's book about Jews, oppression, political action, what do you do as a leader? And given some recent events, it certainly made me think, gee, we've had a real issue about this in recently. Now, I want to find. I may not have opened right. Documents. So give me a moment, and I will open that right document. I think we are all aware that give me a second. Okay, it's up.
You sent us Rabbi Bookdole and Rabbi Cosgrove statements.
Yeah. I gave you both of those.
Yes.
They were both within 2 weeks of each other. They both gave sermons about this.
Right.
Now, this is a very current issue, as we know. Oops, trying to get everything. I will get this. Give me a moment. Let's do that, and let's do the screen share.
It's current about our president. 4 Catholic cardinals came out against Trump yesterday.
Yes, they did.
Which was good.
Okay. Oh, geez. Okay, yeah, this is the one I'm with. Okay, does everyone have this?
Yes.
4 rabbis and other leaders in the U.S. during an election season. This is from 2020. 4 years ago. Actually, it could have been just a year ago. Because as I think most of you know, last summer, there was a decision that clergy people were allowed to make endorsements of political view of figures. Now, prior to that determination, it was very clear, and we'll take a look at this in a second, that rabbis and clergy of congregations should not make endorsements, right? And one can see the arguments, right? Well, what are some of the arguments for or against clergy endorsing candidates?
Well, are they being paid off to endorse them, or is it really from the heart? That was one of the issues.
That's a good question. Is
Well,
there some
my
lineage?
issue
Is
with
there
this,
some corruption, perhaps? All right, Charlie, what were you going to
yeah,
say?
well, my issue is that generally there's a split in the congregation. Some are this way and some are that way. And if the rabbi comes out on one side, there's an alienation of some of the congregants who feel otherwise. So some issues are best, I think, not to be very discreet in terms of how you approach them. And to say one is right and one is wrong with all these complications, nuances, and things we don't know that are not public domain. I mean, it's hard to come on one side on some questions, in my opinion.
Okay, so there's the possibility that within a congregation, I think that the reality that many congregations there are different views. Now, I'll point out there are congregations that are pretty clear where they stand on most of the issues, right? There are some congregations, I can name some congregations. And also the question, how do we distinguish between issues and candidates? Right? Is it okay to preach about issues versus endorsing candidate?
Yes.
Or is that too subtle for most people? Or is it sort of clear if you come again, you talk about certain issues? Well, that's pretty clear who is that not a not so subtle hint that, oh, okay, clergy X has said this, this, and this. There, clergy X is therefore, although not literally endorsing, clearly favors candidate A because candidate A is on that same side. To make a difference,
Yes. And I
legal.
think
Yeah, go ahead. So go ahead, Tammy.
there's a difference between an ethical and a moral issue. And, we're building a new school. Is it going to cost $1 million or going to cost $2 million? So one candidate says 2 million, the other says one. But the third candidate says we don't need schools because we're going to indoctrinate people with dogma. So there's a big difference between two candidates arguing something reasonable and somebody's professing to kill democracy.
Okay, but there could be a difference between, well, we're building a new apartment building. How many apartments should be set aside for people below market rates? Should any? Should a clergy person talk? And by the way, current problem, Bergen County, as well we know.
Right. Well, there's a percentage in the affordable housing that each percentage, there's a state demanded percentage.
Correct. Let's call it the Mount Laurel ruling. Is that
Yeah, and affordable housing too.
Yeah. So there are questions, should we tear down this historic structure and build housing because people need housing? Should we not tear down the historical structure because people need housing? Um, so there are a lot of issues where you would have differences of opinion within the congregation. As I said, some congregation is very clear. I don't think too many people on the more conservative political side would join B'nai Jeshurun in Manhattan. They are very clear where they stand on issues. Same thing with many churches are very clear. But the issue of endorsing candidates, that's the one that has really become an issue this year. Now, the old excuse me, the old rules prior to last summer this is a document with the old rules, right? As pulpit rabbis, educators, we can play important roles in the election process by teaching the values of our Jewish tradition. One could say our Jewish tradition teaches this value, which may be pretty clear politically where that is. However, prior to this last summer, synagogues and other nonprofits are strictly were, not anymore, from participating or intervening in any political campaign on behalf or opposition to any candidate for public office. Throughout my career, I retired years ago. I never publicly endorsed a candidate. Okay. The prohibition on political activity is absolute. Right? You may not endorse or oppose a candidate, target their programs, favor a political party. This was, again, until recently. These restrictions apply to the actions of rabbis and other leaders while acting as representatives of their synagogue. Now, as a private citizen, a rabbi or a minister can do what any private citizen does, right? However, a rabbi or other leader must take steps to ensure their actions are not attributed to their synagogue or organization. So if there was a petition in favor of a certain political position, private citizen Ronald Roth can say Ronald Roth's name is on this petition. What was previously prohibited was it would not be Rabbi Ronald Roth, Rabbi Emeritus of so-and-so. That was what was prohibited, right? Right.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And even if you did that, here's something interesting that they say. Prior to making so if I endorsed as private citizen Ronald Roth the election of I don't know who, rabbis might engage in thoughtful conversations with the leaders of their communities to ensure that these leaders are not surprised to later such coming endorsements. In other words, let's say I was going to sign on to endorsing a candidate as a private citizen. This is just warning. Get ready for it. Might cause some problems. They might want to let people know if that's what you're doing. Okay. Can a rabbi publicly? This is changed. You could, in your personal capacity, right? You can not make this endorsement from the bima. Use synagogue resources. Can I discuss various issues? You can say the government did X, that isn't inconsistent with Jewish values. So I could talk about the issues, say, of capital punishment. I could talk about Jewish sources, and there are many Jewish sources in the Talmud about capital punishment. And I could say, my reading of the Jewish sources about capital punishment says X or Y. That's fine. As opposed to endorsing a candidate whose main political points in his program is to be in favor or opposed. Okay, so that gives you that thing. Okay, all right. Nonprofit, while absolutely prohibited no longer, is allowed to engage in lobbying. Okay, okay. In other words, okay. All right, so we know what things were like before. So what happened? We now know that that has changed. So now the question is being raised. Should rabbis endorse a candidate? Now, what I want to take a look at first are two documents about this issue. One of them thinks it's a good idea, another thinks it's a bad idea. And then we're going to take a look at those two sermons, because this is the really became a very public issue when two rabbis came out on whether or not one should endorse. Okay, so tell me it's not there. Okay, well, let's start with this one. Okay, is the share there? I don't know what's going on. I can't see it.
Yeah.
What's going on with my computer? I do not know. All right, let's try that again. Let's share the screen. And I want to share the screen with this one. Okay, everybody got that?
Yes.
Okay. This is from, I don't remember if they give his bio. This is from a fairly traditional rabbi. Here he is. Michael J. Brody, professor of law at Emory University School of Law, studied Jewish ethics, ordained rabbi. He's an Orthodox rabbi, law, religion, Jewish law. Okay, so here, this is a well-known scholar, a well-known Orthodox rabbi and professor. And what does he say about endorsing with caution Jewish law and the politics of the pulpit? Should rabbis endorse candidates? Okay. There are questions for Rabbi, a practical question more than a theoretical one. If endorsements from the pulpit are now more than tolerated, should rabbis engage in them? And if so, whom should they endorse and why? That's a good question. Okay. Now, he is going to excuse me, one more. Oops, trying to get this oops. Okay. He's going to be very cautious about this, right? Now, he's making some assumptions here. Look at the assumptions he makes in this next sentence. The Jewish tradition entrusts its religious leadership with prudential judgment, prioritizing the overall welfare of the Jewish community and the stability and fairness of the polity in which the Jews live. Endorsement of specific candidates rather than causes, ideas, or values, when appropriate, is less an act of theological alignment and more judgment about security, liberty, and justice for Jews and their neighbors. So in other words, he's going to oppose this. What's his beginning opposition? He says it's less about ideas or values, but about security, liberty, and justice, right? Endorsements can electrify a base, but also alienate congregants, Charlie, as you pointed out, right? Tarnish, what do you think about tarnish the moral voice of the clergy? Is that a possibility? Erode trust among the wider public? Jewish law's diasporic wisdom, shaped by centuries of minority life, has a distinctive emphasis on pluralism and long horizon risk assessment, themes that guide the analysis that follows. So here he's going to say, my reading of Jewish history in the diaspora says that pluralism is an important value. We should not lose pluralism. And the long horizon risk assessment, i.e., be less concerned with a particular candidate of today than with the values long term. Now, these are going to argue against endorsement. And he points out there are some problems. Okay, four dangers. First, halakhic ethical concerns. The Torah's prohibition of placing a stumbling block before the blind warns against leading others into errors. Okay, when a rabbinic imprimatur causes congregants to conflate divine will with a political program, or to excuse grave misconduct because the rabbi said so, the result may be either a violation of this prohibition or a desecration of God's name. Wow. In other words, if we say it's God's will to vote for this candidate, we are making a statement that seems to consider that divine will, and this politician is a reflection of divine will, And that's could be a problem. Now he points out if the endorsed official behaves corruptly or even personally immorally. What happens when a clergy person endorses a candidate because that candidate is in favor of a policy that the rabbi believes is divine will, but that candidate is corrupt or immoral? What do you think of that? Yeah,
The
Tammy?
the rabbi is only a human being. He's just stating his opinion. He doesn't have the divine will. We don't consider rabbis gods. Rabbi is a teacher. He's saying something, and it's not the divine that's coming through his mouth. He's giving us an opinion, and you're reading too much into this. He's making it more insane than it should be. He's giving us an opinion and what he thinks. I mean, should you vote for Mickey Sherrill or should you vote for the other guy? You know, you have an opinion, but you're not God. And people can agree with your opinion or not agree with your opinion. And you based your opinion on what you thought was right.
But you could say candidate X or candidate Y has a program,
Right,
and the values of that program are more in line with the values of Judaism.
right.
Now, you may disagree with that, right? There are
Right.
people who could disagree about that, but the rabbi could say that. And what he's pointing out is that there's a lot of danger in doing that. And by the way, I think we see this more in the Christian community, as we know that there are many in the conservative Christian community who will endorse a candidate based upon their positions on, like, shall we say, a more conservative view of the world. And they may have at the same time this question: what if the endorsed official behaves corruptly or even personally immorally?
Well, we have a president who's done all that and everybody's following him.
We've had some governors and others in the state of New Jersey who have gone to jail. Well, not to jail, who in point of fact have done so. Right? So there's a real problem. How do you distinguish if you think this candidate is worthy of your support because you think this person is consistent with the values that you're teaching about Judaism, but is personally problematic, right? That's a concern. Okay. Actually, I think our time is up. Excuse me. Any other comment? We're gonna look at this in more detail, and we'll see here. This article, as we said, is an article. And those of you who've gotten the articles, Rabbi Hammerman takes the opposite position, and then you'll see the differences between Rabbis Buchdahl and Rabbi Cosgrove, which we'll talk about next week, which I think was a perfect example where when you have a situation with a candidate with very problematic positions, do you, as a rabbi, make a statement? We'll see the differences there. Okay, comments, questions?
Good topic, Rabbi.
What?
A very good topic.
Yeah,
Thank you.
very
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, we're fighting it every single day.
That's
Yeah,
right.
I will say this. Someone once said to me, member of the congregation, listen to my sermons over the years, couldn't tell which side of the political spectrum I was on, which I thought was an interesting comment because I certainly never endorsed candidates, but I thought I was somewhat clear as to where I was on some issues, but maybe I wasn't.
There is the issue also, Rabbi, of Jewish law versus secular law.
Mhm.
You brought up capital punishment. Capital punishment is all over the Torah. Profanity is capital punishment, against God.
Right. But
So,
again,
so I mean, it's very complicated. All these things are. You get into the secular law, you get into civil law, you get into religious law, and sometimes even today they're in conflict with each other.
that's true. So how do you deal in a secular society there are those who would say, well, look, those in Israel who are arguing that Israeli law, which is secular law, should be more in line with the Torah, right?
But it's also the interpretation of the Torah. The conservative and reform movements have taken the Torah and added commentary and interpretation in terms of modern times, whereas some of the crazies on the right are saying, oh, you can kill people, you an eye for an eye, you should go poke somebody's eye out.
No.
That's not the way it is.
No, they will never argue. Let me say this. They will argue some very traditional values. By the way, they themselves know they can't argue eye for an eye because the Torah, the rabbis of the Talmud say you can't do that. But the question, I'll give you an example. An Israeli legislator has suggested that terrorists should be executed rather than having all these terrorists in the jails, which he claims only encourages radical groups to take Israelis hostage. And if you killed the terrorists, if they were convicted of killing Israelis, that could solve that problem. It gets a little complicated. But anyway, we're going to talk some more about this. I'm glad to see all of you here. I hope more of our class will be back on a regular schedule, because this to me is I'm sorry.
Yeah, he is.
Excuse me. I'm sort of very glad Rabbi Barmash sort of sparked my interest because of that, even that Rabbi Shapiro, which really isn't exactly about what we're talking about here, but does touch upon that, and was, to me, a very interesting point to talk about this question today.
It's also about that woman, Renee Good. He shot once, but then he went and gave her 2 more shots. So how could somebody justify 3 shots to somebody? You can't. But there's so many people who are saying she deserved it. Insanity.
Yeah, well, that again, as a rabbi, if I was in the pulpit, would I be traveling to Minneapolis next Friday for there's a national clergy march in Minneapolis that's occurring next Friday. But we can talk about some of these issues in detail as we go along. Again, thank you all for coming, and we'll
Thank
see
you.
you.
Feel better.
Rabbi, feel better.
Thank you, Rabbi. I feel better.
Yeah.